did then, but one thing I knew even then, it's not good for a child to be unhappy. Probably our biggest job as parents is to find places where our children are happy. Because if you are unhappy as a child, you're likely to grow up unhappy as an adult. And so that overwhelmed, and my wife even more so. She didn't worry so much as I did. Or two of his being there, and I was very happy. I could see it was in many ways working very well from him. The sparkle was coming back into his eyes. He was his old lively, really curious, playful, wonderful person that I had known before he started school. His personality came back to him. But the thing about students who have had charge of their whole life while they're growing up, making their own decisions, deciding themselves what they're going to learn, figuring out how to learn it, they acquire an ability that I think is probably, well, it's certainly, I'm going to talk about a lot of things that I think are the most important abilities, right? But this is certainly one of the most important abilities, which is to take responsibility for your life. To say, I'm the one, I'm not going to blame other people for where I am, who I am. I'm not going to blame the conditions. I am responsible for my life. I'm going to figure out how to take responsibility. So when they went to college, they took responsibility for their life. If they took a course and they were feeling like they were going to be behind, they took responsibility to figure out what they needed to know. So this impressed me. As a college teacher, I thought, oh wow, I would love to have a classroom of students like that, as opposed to students who are there not really sure why they're there, and they're, if I ask for questions at the end of the lecture, somebody raises their hand and say, are we responsible for this on the test? That's the biggest question you get, as opposed to some kind of intellectual challenge to what I'm asking about. So at any rate, that's a little bit of an introduction. And so that got, because what Sudbury Valley does, and they didn't do this deliberately, I think it's just, they just hit upon it. They've provided the conditions that are very similar, but for our modern world, to what the children are in a hunter-gatherer world. They're in a situation where they're able to play and explore and pursue their own interests all day long. In a situation where there's a lot of other kids and it's age mix, and the little kids can learn from the bigger kids by playing with the bigger kids and observing them. In a situation where the adults are not judging them or telling them what to do, but the adults love them. And the adults care for them. And if they go to an adult and ask a question, the adult is happy to answer the question. And if they ask for help, the adult is happy to give the help. But the adult doesn't intervene. The adult doesn't push himself or herself upon the child. And when adults don't push themselves, children are actually more willing to go to the adult. They don't want somebody to push themselves on them. And so they kind of don't trust adults. I mean, like if a typical kid might not go to Sharanya to ask her a question if she thinks that Sharanya is going to respond by telling them all kinds of stuff that they didn't ask. They don't want that. Yeah. They just want her to answer that question. And that's it. And then they want to do the rest themselves. That's the way children are. They don't want that. Yeah. They just want her to answer that question. And that's it. And then they want to do the rest themselves. That's the way children are. And after observing what happens in country, I can see that. There's another thing that I want to say about childhood. What is the ultimate purpose of childhood is to take charge of your own life. And the only way you can take charge of your own life is by rejecting the help and advice that everybody else wants to give you, to some degree at least. That doesn't mean you totally reject it. But that creates tension often in families. So the child doesn't want to do what the parent wants them to do. And in many cultures, this becomes a battle of wills, right? What's interesting about the hunter-gatherer culture and what happens at the Sudbury Valley School, it's not a battle of wills, because the child really is allowed to do what the child wants to do and is trusted about it. So it's an entirely different way of thinking about childhood and thinking about the relationship between parents and children, between adults and children generally. So that's kind of an introduction to, I've mentioned some of the things I've done. I've done quite a number of other things having to do with understanding how children learn. But I'm going to stop. I've been sort of rambling on for a while, so let me just stop and
So, no, going from what you said, this sounds like an ideal environment for children if they're there from say 3 or 4 all the way till 18, right?
Right.
But what if I come from a family where I have to transfer when I'm 10 years old to probably another city which doesn't have a self-directed environment, and I have to go to a traditional school? Then what about my academic goals or the things that are expected milestones or measurable of numeracy skills or literacy, whatever it is? Different cultures, of course, have different measures, but what happens then? So
I'll answer your second question first. At the time that I did the study, I would say that about half, a little bit more than half the students, maybe 2/3 of the students who were there were people who had gone to the public school first. And like my son, for one reason or another, it didn't work for them. And so the parents, maybe out of desperation, maybe because they kind of believed in this philosophy, decided to send their child there. But I would say another third sent their children there right from the beginning, because for one reason or another, they were what I would now say enlightened. They knew they believed this was going to be best for their children. Some of these people were from a background of, what's called natural parenting. They breastfed their children for years, took their children to sleep in the same bed and these kinds of things. And to many of those parents, this seemed like a natural progression from that. That this seemed like a more natural way for children to learn. So some of them were in that category. Some of them were in people who had read some of these ideas had already been around for some long time. There's a very famous book by John Holt one book called Why Children Fail, which was about why children fail in school, and another about how children learn. And some of the people had read that book. And John Holt was really in many ways a genius who developed many of the same ideas that I have been researching and talking about. Some of them were inspired by that book to do something different with their children rather than send them to a school. Another question about how do they, what happens if they have to move away, they have to go to another school. Now, I've already said what happens if they go to college. And basically, I could say the same thing if they have to go to another school, that they pretty quickly catch up. I didn't do this study, but there was another study done well after I did this study that looked at not only the graduates of the school, but everybody who had been at the school for 2 years. So even like somebody who had been there, for maybe 3 or 4 years and left at age 10 or 11 to go to a regular school, maybe because they moved, and asked these people, how did it work out? And basically, everyone went into whatever the grade would be for the age that they were. And sometimes they would say, well, there's certain things I had to catch up on. So somebody might have gone, so here's one of the things that happens in this school. Not everybody learns there's certain things that I said everybody learns to read. Everybody learns to read, but not everybody learns to read at age 6, right? Some people learn to read earlier than that. But that's not the way learning really occurs. Learning occurs in bursts when you want to know it. When you either are so curious about it that you have to know it, you can't stop the person from learning, or you've reached a point in life where you need to know this. I did a study of learning to read in which I interviewed, these were not graduates, these were not students in Sudbury Valley, but these were families that have chosen what's called unschooling. So these are homeschooling families, but who don't provide a curriculum for their children at home. They allow their children to pursue their own interests. And they help the children pursue their own interests, and they help the children make contact with other children so the children are not isolated, help connect them to the community. So I did a study of how children in that situation learn to read. The parents don't teach reading, just like doesn't occur at Sudbury Valley. They don't force the children to read. They might help the child learn to read if the child asks for help, and the same is true at Sudbury Valley. So I did this survey of them, and also previous to that, some of my students at Boston College had done a little study of learning to read at Sudbury Valley. So I combined those two studies, and what we were interested in is how old was the child when they learned to read, and why did they learn to read? To the degree that the child could remember, to the degree that the parents could remember, and for kids at Sudbury Valley to the degree that the staff members could remember. And the kinds of stories I would get were like this. So one young woman who had been an unschooled girl said that my mother would read to me at night. And she was reading the Harry Potter. And I got really interested in the Harry Potter. But my mother could only read for a certain amount of time. And I got impatient. I couldn't wait. And so I said, I'm going to finish this book. And I learned how to read. There was another who's, this was a little boy who liked to play, who liked to do things on the computer. And he would always ask his older brother to read the words for him. And at some point, his older brother said, I'm sick and tired of reading the words to you, and walked away. And that was when that little boy decided, well, I'm going to have to learn to read. So it's interesting that when people see a need to do it, and I have yet to find any person who's grown up in our culture at the Sudbury Valley School or in an unschooling situation who doesn't at some point see it would be really neat to be able to read.
The article you wrote about the whole and the parts, would that connect with this concept where you learn math as a whole, not as various levels? Could you tell us a little bit about
trying to teach, and we break it down into parts. We think this is the reasonable way to teach stuff. So, we start with the elements. It's like we're chemists. We're going to start with that. We're going to start with the atoms, and then we're going to work towards the molecules, and then we'll work towards the whole thing. So when we teach reading, the first thing is everybody has to memorize the alphabet and recognize the letters. And then we teach them the sounds of the letters. Nothing could be more boring than that, right? It has no meaning to the child, zero meaning to the child. So we teach them this, and then we gradually move from that to, in English, cat, C-A-T, cat, right? How interesting is that? But when children are learning to read on their own, that's not how they learn to read. They don't think of themselves ever as learning to read. This is an interesting thing. If you ask a child, what are you learning, you'll get a blank face back. Children don't think that they don't think of themselves as learning. That's adult language. Children think of themselves as doing things. Ask a child what you did today, and you may or may not get an answer. The child may not want to tell you what they did, but the child knows what he did. He doesn't know what he learned. Knows what he did. He'll tell you what he did. And what happens in childhood, and the way children learn in hunter-gatherer bands, at Sudbury Valley, in any natural setting, and children go to school, I would argue that most of their real learning is out of school, no matter how much they're going to school. They're learning not because they're sitting down to learn. They're learning because they're doing stuff. And the learning is a consequence of doing stuff. So a child learning to read never goes through a stage of learning to read. The child starts right off reading. In the child's mind, the child is reading. I could call it learning to read because as an adult observer. So let me give you, I can tell the story of my own son learning to read. He happened to learn too long after he could talk. He would point to a sign and say, "What's it say?" And I would say, "Exit," because he had asked the question. I wasn't trying to teach him to read. I was just answering his question. So he was really reading. He now, every time he saw the sign exit, he would say, "Exit." And then, and he learned that way. He would point to words. He wanted to know what that word said. He was teaching himself to read, but I don't think he would articulate that he was teaching himself to read. He would say, "I'm reading it, and I don't happen to know how to read that word, so I want you to tell me it," right? It turns out there's been, these kids who are called precocious readers, it turns out there's actually been research, and they're not precocious in other ways. My son wasn't. He's probably a little brighter than the average person, but there are people who are precocious readers who have just average IQs. They're not, in other ways, they're not geniuses. Their brains aren't any different from anybody else as far as anybody can tell. They're just people who, for whatever reason, got interested in reading. To me, that's pretty interesting. Learning to read can't be all that hard if a 3-year-old can do it, right, without being taught. And yet we make it so hard in school. But the point here is that for children who are learning to read, they don't think of themselves as learning to read. They start right off reading whatever they can. They are self-correcting. At some point they realize, well, I'm not actually doing it the way I see the other people doing it. I'm actually not. I'm not writing anything that anybody else can read. and I'm kind of missing the point of typing. And so therefore they start, and he goes through a number of examples of different ways that children learn.
With with a lot of land and a lot of free space to run and explore the environment, and that of course makes for a great environment for people to learn in, right? But more and more, all of us are at least in an urban setting where that kind of space is not easy to get. And for people like us at Quest, which is a rather tiny space, how do we ensure that there's enough that children get exposure to, so there is constantly something that's stimulating in the environment? And what's your take on technology? Is that a good part of this environment, or
Well, great questions. Yeah, one of the things, so if you see Sudbury Valley, you think, well, this is a luxurious space, and we can't have that kind of space in the city or something wherever we live. So what's interesting to me is that by now there are actually many schools modeled after Sudbury Valley. They've taken Sudbury Valley, they haven't exactly replicated, but similar to the same philosophy. The children play and explore all day long. They're not forced to take any classes. They're age mixed and so on and so forth. And many of these are in cities, and they don't have, if they have any outdoor playground at all, it's just a little one, and often no outdoor playground. And they're in somewhat cramped spaces. So at first I wondered, well, how would it work, without all this luxury of being able to have rocks to climb on and a forest to go running in and a pond to go fishing in. So I visited some of these. There's one in New York, in New York City. There's actually a lot of them in city settings. There's one in Chicago. There's one in Berlin, believe it or not. And none of these have outdoor spaces. And they're settings somewhat like this, although I would say this is bigger and better than what I observed in those places. But even in those places, it worked. I think what is critical is that the space have a number of different rooms so people can get away from one another. You've got some people who want to read books and they want it quiet, or and you've got some people who want to play music, and you've got to have some place that the music isn't destroying the rest of the environment for the other people. You've got to have, you've got some people who want to build things, and so you need some place for people where you've got the tools for building certain kinds of things. So you need to have a number of different rooms where there are different options of what's going on. Most of these schools have kitchens, and kids love to cook. Kids love to cook things. And so there's a lot of different things to do indoors, and they try to arrange some outdoor time. If there is an outdoor space, the kids can go outdoors wherever they want. But if there isn't, they'll typically arrange, and oftentimes if this is in a big city, typically if it's little kids going, you've got to have at least one or two bigger kids going with them, or an adult going with them, because the parents would be upset. And there could be some risk if a bunch of little kids went to themselves off to the park. But they usually have some arrangement to be able to go off to a park. And so that's the way that's handled, and it seems to work fine. It seems to work fine.